Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce Jenny Kissinger, one of our counselors here on campus, who will be providing the welcome and introduction.
Hi everyone, welcome. This event is put on by the Student Support Committee and Clarkson students, employees, and at online and in person. And then we're also having Nebraska Medicine employees and all of their people on the Zoom as well. And for Clarkson students and just Clarkson students, just know that you can do the IPE for knowledge and community credits by completing the IPE reflection in module 5 for the next 90 days. And as employees of Nebraska Medicine and Clarkson, you can also earn 200 points for the in the Empower portal by selecting I did this and answering some questions. This event is going to be recorded, so you guys can go back and view it online. And I'm going to introduce Jeff, who is the clinical director at Arbor Family Therapy, and he's going to talk today about our wonderful topic, mushrooms and hallucinogenics. Welcome, Jeff.
Jeff, we can't hear you, so if you're talking, do you want to make sure that you're not?
Sorry, yes. I was just saying I'm going to try to share my video too, but I don't think it'll show while I'm sharing. Anyway, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Terrific. All right. Well, hello. Thanks for attending today. Very sorry I couldn't be there in person. That was the plan. I've got a good dose of the bugs that are going around. Just got antibiotics started, so hope to be over the hump in a day or two. Hopefully not too many coughing breaks here. But yeah, I'm Jeff Penzer. I'm a mental health practitioner here in the Omaha area. My wife and I have lived here for many years. We have 3 children. They are age 23, 20, and 19, just for a little context there. But I've worked in private practice and other mental health settings for just over 20 years. As Jenny mentioned, I served as the clinical director for Arbor Family Counseling, which is part of Trivium Life Services. I've worked with a lot of different age groups, both in the office. I work in the community as well, in schools. I provide crisis response services, and then I support our full team of clinical providers. Very excited to present on this interesting and ever-evolving topic. There's a lot of information about the topic as a whole, hallucinogens and what are often referred to as psychedelic drugs or even medicines now. But I know that the request was to kind of focus a little bit more on hallucinogenic mushrooms, specifically psilocybin, and then of course provide mental health perspective. So I'll try to weave that into our talk today as much as I can. I think the only disclaimer I would have is that Arbor Family Counseling does provide student and employee assistance programs for Clarkson College and UNMC. So I will leave it there, and we will hopefully get the show on the road. Okay, so today I thought we would focus on these topics, learn about hallucinogens and dissociative drugs, their use, effects, and risks of the substances, and then a little deep dive into psilocybin mushrooms specifically. And if time allows, talk through a little bit of the controversy over psychedelic treatments and medicines. And either at the end or throughout, I'll try to provide as many mental health examples or some other context related to the topic. I will say that this is a broad subject, and as we get right into hallucinogens and dissociative drugs, there's lots of slang terms, chemical compounds, big words, small words, silly words, and I'll try to use as many as I can to just give a brief overview. The term psychedelic is used more often than specifically hallucinogen and dissociative drugs, and we're talking about people either experimenting or finding a way to use these drugs on their own. to, help in whatever way that they believe that they're helping, or in, clinical settings under medical trials that are currently going on. So just wanted to kind of clear that up. So moving right in. So some definitions about just the substances as a whole. Hallucinogens, this is a class of psychoactive substances that produces change in perception, mood, and cognitive processes. So hallucinogens will affect all the senses. They can alter a person's thinking, sense of time, their emotions. They can cause a person to hallucinate, hence the name, right? Hallucinogen. Seeing or hearing things that do not exist or that might be distorted. Dissociative is the class of drugs that can cause one to feel separated or detached from their body or physical environment. They can also cause hallucinations and other changes in thought, emotions, and consciousness. So you may be aware of the term dissociative anesthetic, right? If we think of things like nitrous oxide, something that's used at the dental office, for example, right? So then I have psychedelics with a question mark, because psychedelics can kind of comprise both of these categories and some others. So I wanted to have kind of a working definition of psychedelics. So psychedelic drugs, also known as hallucinogens and dissociatives, they constitute a class of also psychoactive substances that induce perceptual, cognitive, and emotional changes by interacting with neurotransmitter systems in the brain. So the psychedelic kind of explanation gets a little more specific on kind of what these things do, not just maybe the effect. Psychedelic research has a lot to do with, impactful change that a psychedelic experience under the influence of a hallucinogen or a dissociative might bring about. I know that's a mouthful. So we will move on to just kind of go over some of the different types of drugs or substances, or in some cases, organic compounds that we're talking about. So these are classic hallucinogens. LSD, commonly, just called acid, lysergic, diethylmide, psilocybin, which is commonly referred to as magic mushrooms, many other names, mescaline, peyote, these are other classic hallucinogens. Some of the classic dissociatives, PCP, phencyclidine, ketamine, referred to as special K when it's used kind of illicitly or, out of a clinical environment, DXM, MXC, salvia, divinorium, and nitrous oxide. This other category, psychedelics and psychoactives. I'll talk a little bit quickly about MDMA, because this is actually a empathogen, which is a separate class from hallucinogens and dissociatives. But I think that's a good example of a drug falling under the psychedelic drug or psychedelic medicine category. It's really not a hallucinogen or a dissociative, but it has some of those properties. But empathogens, are focused more on sensory alteration, increased arousal, things like that. But it's kind of lumped into psychedelic categories. DMT is another one you may have heard about recently. That's something that's derived from plants and animals. Ayahuasca, been in the news a little bit too. These last two, I won't explain in great length, but NBOMES and 2CB, these are newer compounds similar to LSD, but they are ingested in different ways, not orally, and we'll get a little bit more into that too. So just a quick overview. So I wanted to not bore you with uses and risks. I'm trying here to really give a general overview of methods and use of both hallucinogens and dissociatives and kind of psychoactive substances as a whole. So I might jump around with some of the different substances here, but little background in history, many cultures worldwide have employed psychedelics due to their mystical and spiritual significance. So substances such as LSD, magic mushrooms or psilocybin, mescaline, DMT are typically consumed through methods like swallowing, smoking, or inhalation. Mushrooms are generally ingested fresh, dried, cooked, brewed into a tea, or more recently packaged as chocolate in some of the states that have decriminalized psilocybin. Mescaline, for example, is commonly ingested. Peyote buttons, if you've ever heard about those, they're ground into powder. They can be smoked with tobacco or some kind of cannabis. Sometimes the buttons are stewed or soaked in water to create a liquid form. I mentioned these two other new ones, the MBOMEs. These are often inactive when swallowed, even though they might come in a pill or powder or liquid form. So those are usually placed, under the tongue on a piece of blotter paper, somewhere that they can sublingually be absorbed. If they're powder form, they can be snorted. So generally, I wanted to also note individuals who typically use psychedelic substances, and I will say it is illicitly because these are not legalized substances. They are not being prescribed in any way. But generally, people who either experiment or use these substances do not consume them regularly. Instead, the use is intermittent, spaced out over weeks, months, sometimes years. And I think just in looking at this quick slide, we can see, there's a big difference from some of the other, drugs or substances that are typically consumed by us humans, right? Very different from alcohol, which is a depressant, cannabis, which is, a cannabinoidal substance, opioids, stimulants. Most of these are, pretty, have pretty well established vehicles for use, right? Smoking, pills, sometimes injections, and of course, ingesting with alcohol. So you can see there's lots of different ways these substances can enter the system. And the only other thing I'll mention too is, as I talk about some of the use and risks, I want to be clear, I'm talking about both recreational use and some of the clinical applications of these substances. Not condoning either one, either way. Okay, a little more about effects of use. Again, generally considering all those subjects that we just talked about, all those different types of drugs and compounds. So the impact of use is going to vary a lot among individuals with all these different factors, size, weight, health, how familiar you are with the substance, concurrent use of other drugs, the dosage, and the potency, which of course can be a large difference in the potency if you're using street drugs, right? You're not quite sure where they're coming from. So the duration and natural effects are going to vary significantly depending on the specific substance used. Here's some common side effects, and there can be a lot of crossover here, but a feeling of euphoria, a sense of relaxation or well-being, perceptions of seeing or hearing things not present, confusion and difficulty concentrating, dizziness, blurred vision, clumsiness, rapid or irregular heart rate, accelerated breathing, vomiting, sweating and chills, numbness. So quite a mixed bag of effects there, right? And I also want to point out that experimentation is really key with a lot of these substances. As you might guess, a lot of people are trying to achieve some of those more desirable effects, euphoria, that doesn't sound too bad, relaxation and well-being, what's wrong with that? Maybe, seeing some things and having a little fun. But when we get into some of the other ones, maybe stumbling around, having some physiological symptoms like an increased heart rate that could induce all sorts of other things, vomiting, sweating, and chills, numbness. Not so fun. So I just want to point out there's a mixed bag of effects there. These are some other impacts and situations. So psychoactive drugs are affecting a person's mental state. They can manifest birth effects contingent upon a person's mood. And in psychedelic kind of culture and even in research, this is referred to as set, or the environment that they find themselves in when they are under the influence of the substance, known as setting. So quick definition on those two, because those will come up a little later. The set is your state of mind, right? The person's state of mind. This can include, your past experiences with psychedelic drugs, or any other substances, and the anticipation of any forthcoming event. So kind of just where the person is at the time. An example, if you had pre-existing feelings of stress or anxiety before consuming a psychedelic drug, this could certainly contribute to an unpleasant experience, historically referred to as a bad trip. We'll talk about those also. So the setting probably makes a little more sense in terms of, where you are, who you're with, what's going on in the environment. So the surroundings where one consumes psychedelic drugs, encompassing familiarity, companionship. This can be indoor, outdoor settings, other factors, music, lighting. An example of this, if someone was, either in a clinical setting or experimenting and wanting to mitigate, some risk for the setting being problematic for them, creating calm, quiet, relaxed environment, and enhance or contribute to this experience. Noisy, crowded settings may lead to negative experiences. And again, these are very much subjective to the individual person. Again, not promoting use, more as a cautionary and educational statement about what one might experience. So generally, it's agreed that maintaining a positive mindset, being in the company of trusted friends, ensuring safe environment before taking psychedelics mitigates the risk of negative experiences. Okay, some more risks and some of these situations. So I'm sure you've maybe heard the expression bad trip, and sometimes that brings about some scary ideas, and I think for good reason. The definition generally is frightening, disturbing hallucinations that can result in panic, unpredictable behavior. Two examples: running across the road, or even something highly dangerous, even attempting suicide. So there have been accounts of this, and those stories kind of hold true. So people have kind of associated bad trips with psychedelic compounds and drugs with fear. So some of the factors there: large doses or potent batches of psychedelics are more likely to induce negative effects. Flashbacks is another term that you'll hear a lot. It's the most common long-term effect of psychedelic use. It's re-experiencing of the drug or its effects, or some of the experiences you had under the influence of the drug. That could be days, weeks, months, even years later. Things that can trigger flashbacks: use of other drugs, stress in your life, fatigue, even physical exercise, changes in body chemistry, can just kind of loosen up maybe some residual, remnants of the substance, and can create these, oftentimes unpleasant experiences. Not always, but so these can range, like as I said, from pleasant to severe anxiety. Flashbacks are typically visual, last for a brief period. Another situation to consider, the mixing of psychedelics with other drugs. If you combine psychedelics with substances like alcohol, prescription medication, or with over-the-counter meds, these can result in very unpredictable outcomes. Stimulants, for example, can be intensified when they are in your system and you introduce psychedelic drugs, which obviously can not be good because stimulants are already doing what they're supposed to do, whether they're prescribed or being taken illicitly, and that can create, significant anxiety, other physiological symptoms for sure. With benzodiazepines, combining psychedelics with those can heighten anxiety, induce some sadness, accelerate the heart rate. So again, really a mixed bag if you are taking other medications or other drugs and you introduce any of these substances. A few more risks that we'll go over. The use of any drug inherently involves a level of risk. And so if one chooses to use psychedelics in any way, very careful consideration can include all of the following. I put this under the category of harm reduction and awareness of others. Again, if you come across someone who is, under the influence of psychedelic, drugs or medication as it might be, these are things to consider for them. If you know someone who is thinking of experimenting with them, right? These are very, safe ways to kind of help support that person. So there's a lot of unpredictability of strength and effects. We kind of talked about that with the potency, mental health considerations. If someone has pre-existing conditions or a family history, certainly anything in the realm of psychosis or schizophrenia, these are high risk individuals for taking anything from those categories of drugs. Having that safe environment, we talked about the setting, and a little extra information on the increased risk if combined with alcohol or other drugs. Talked about stimulants, certainly things like methamphetamine, anything that requires, this is kind of like your, warning on the box if there was one, right? Operating machinery, driving, anything that requires using judgment. Psychedelics alone can be risky, especially in situations where medical assistance might be necessary. Again, largely due to the unpredictable nature of what someone might experience who has not had them before. And then again, a little extra on having mental health issues. Those individuals are at an increased risk as well. A little more on harm reduction. So this is where I'll take a little aside to talk about some of the mental health and kind of substance use and abuse components, the dependence and tolerance. So most psychedelics, they lead to a very quick tolerance development, which, as you know, means larger doses to achieve the same effect over time. You can think of other substances that have this similar effect: cannabis, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, right? And the concern there, obviously, is that you can develop psychological dependence on these substances. There's not a lot of physical dependence that is noted in any of these substances, nor a lot of withdrawal symptoms due to there not being a lot of physical dependency risk. But from my perspective, the increased tolerance is certainly a concern, especially if these are being used illicitly, like many other substances are, to escape life or escape problems or to numb out emotions. If those are perceived to be, helping with that goal, the concern is, right, that your tolerance will continue to rise for that substance. And we know that life doesn't stop producing problems or difficult emotions or situations that you'll have to deal with. So the slippery slope is very real for these substances, just like any other, because of the psychological dependence and that rapid tolerance development. Just a note on harm reduction, it involves making informed choices, understanding the contextual factors that can influence the risk associated with psychedelic use. Okay, so we'll do a deeper dive here into psychedelic mushrooms. I'm guessing that was kind of asked to be a larger focus just because of the gaining popularity, the decriminalization, and the ongoing research that's being done on their application for treatment of mental health issues and existential dilemmas such as end-of-life issues. I have some suggested reading if this is a topic you're deeply interested in, but I will just kind of briefly go through the history here. They've had kind of psychedelic mushrooms have had a kind of complex history, but it's long. Back in the Spanish conquest and colonization of Mexico, they were being used by indigenous tribes for ceremonies, right? Would refer to those as well, they were referred to by outsiders as sacred rituals. They referred to the mushrooms as flesh of the gods. The conquistadors were not too happy about that because they thought it kind of sounded like the Holy Eucharist and had some religious implications. So they tried to quash the use of them, drove the practice underground. The indigenous healing rituals continued in these areas, and they continue today, led by spiritual healers who have passed down some of the knowledge of how to lead these ceremonies. I'll skip to 1955. This couple, Dr. Valencia Wasson and her husband, R. Gordon Wasson, they kind of rediscovered them in down, this is near, Mexico City, and had the opportunity to try them, didn't really understand what was going on, tried to get in touch with a prominent spiritual leader, and subsequently were able to participate in a ceremony, came back to the United States. There were articles published about these healing properties. This is sacred medicine, really just kind of promoting interest. There were lots of publications made, and the interest just kind of grew. Someone that this couple knew well was Albert Hoffman. He was the kind of accidental discoverer of LSD. They kind of paired up. They sent him a sample in Europe. So these are very, clandestine tests, nothing too scientific about them. He was intrigued, went on a trip with them. They contacted someone who was able to provide another ritual experience. So he was kind of, hooked on the idea as well. Again, very brief overview. There are books on almost each of these subjects, so feel free to dive deeper. A little bit more on research. So now we're into the 60s, and the research on psychedelic mushrooms has gained a lot of momentum. And in the 70s, there were aims to legitimize medical research of psilocybin. This was led by someone named Dr. Roland Griffith. There was another man named Paul Stamets, who was kind of an amateur micrologist who had a deep interest in mushrooms as a species and learned about psilocybin mushrooms, and he ended up discovering species of mushrooms containing psilocybin in the U.S. And as we move forward, the genus of psilocybin now has 116 psilocybin positive species. So it started with like a locally harvested organism far away, and ends up being something that occurs very naturally all around. So just wanted to kind of give a warp speed review of that. So then we're into the 90s, and Dr. Roland Griffith, who took a strong interest in the research, along with somebody partnered with named Bill Richards, they approached Johns Hopkins Hospital to start some research. Again, at this time, the substance psilocybin is still federally, outlawed. So they had to, of course, go through a lot of time and red tape to get these trials greenlighted. So studies continued at Johns Hopkins throughout the 90s, very limited, but also some studies on the effects of psilocybin with OCD at Yale, and in the treatment of cancer patients at the Aquilino Cancer Center. And there's many others, but those are some of the highlights. Again, each of these are very deep subjects, but essentially there's a lot of spirituality associated with psilocybin use. Despite challenges, the exploration of the spiritual dimension of psilocybin has continued. And this is one of the major themes that you'll see that is driving a lot of the research for help with people facing existential crises and fear of death, trying to kind of make peace with a very, scary, very uncertain time in their life. And we'll get into the treatment protocol and things like that. There's a lot of language, and again, a lot of the books that you'll see on the subject, very, some are kind of drug culture influenced, some are just purely kind of psychedelically influenced, some are just natural world influenced, just like, wow, this is neat, these things can do this, and they're naturally occurring, or they have very interesting effects on the human brain and not on other species. Why is that? So lots and lots of questions there. But overall, the initial research was aimed to bridge spirituality and science. So kind of exploring the concept of having a revelation, trying to make a connection with the spiritual dimension beyond current scientific lens. So again, right, lots of things that create some controversy. So we'll touch on that too. But overall, the transcendental experiences reported by cancer patients seem to provide this sense of comfort in the belief that the universe would take care of them. So again, that's kind of the why that this particular compound has continued to move along in terms of kind of acceptance within certain groups on how it can be helpful for certain situations. Some more recent trends, these states, Oregon, California, Colorado, Washington, DC, and Michigan have decriminalized the recreational use of psilocybin. Microdosing is a term you may have heard. I have a lot of information on that, but essentially it involves taking a very small amount, and not just psilocybin, other substances are also used for microdosing. So it's not limited to psilocybin, but it's gained a lot of attention for its potential for mood enhancement or cognitive enhancement. Not too long ago, there were a lot of stories out of Silicon Valley about tech moguls using it to help their teams be more creative or to create a kind of harmonious work environment. Again, these things are all done, I would say, illicitly, right? There's lots of underground literature on how to do it, and you can look up a step-by-step guide, I'm sure. But again, these are all things that have just kind of grown from some of these historical uses, these spiritual uses, and mixed with the criminalization of it, it creates this kind of counterculture all by itself. So today, still, psilocybin is a Schedule I controlled substance in the United States. So good to note that. So, quick little slide here. Hard to, go in depth about some of these things, but this kind of sums up what goes on, right? It decreases brain activity in the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of something that I'm sure you are aware of called the default mode network, which in layman's terms is kind of shut off or suspended under the influence of psilocybin. And this area of the brain is kind of where that prefrontal cortex is operating. Again, my limited understanding of that, but so a little bit about the kind of the controversy involving psychedelic medicine as a whole versus illicit drug use. Again, any use of these substances outside of a controlled environment with approval and regulations would be considered illicit. But you are going to continue to hear the term psychedelic medicine, psychedelic psychotherapy, psychedelic treatment, continuing to gain popularity. So again, many subtopics here. Safety concerns. Many of the critics, I would say, of the use of these substances are going to tell you, that there are numerous safety risks, right? And especially outside of controlled clinical settings. Certainly concerns about adverse reactions, unpredictable responses, potential for harm. Certainly with people with pre-existing mental health conditions, some of those risks that we talked about earlier. Again, more info on the risk of the mental health issues. There is great concern that if someone has an existing mental health condition, certainly psychosis, certainly schizophrenia, that these would be exacerbated. There's a lot of concern also that if someone might be predisposed to these conditions, that the effects of these could impact the onset of some of those conditions. So again, very serious concerns, and rightfully so. The lack of standardization, although the approved clinical trials, right, are standardized, the concern is, people will try to replicate those, kind of do them on their own, which does occur. Kind of underground therapy has kind of sprung into the scene here. And under those conditions, the dosage, the preparation, the therapeutic approach can make it very challenging to determine if the results are consistent and reliable. Just a lot of variability when there is not standardization, obviously. Excuse me. The lack of understanding of long-term effects, unknown risk. Right, lots of concerns about the potential for long-term psychedelic use. Although we talked about tolerance and the lack of physical dependency, the psychological dependency on something that, for example, could have such a profound effect on you, or numb out, or break down your fears and worries. Chasing that could maybe become a lifelong endeavor. And so using these outside of clinical settings, there's great concern about just the scope of risk and the consequences. Plenty of ethical considerations when it comes to subject. Of course, you want to have ethical standards in research, any therapeutic practice, that's very crucial, but very hard to maintain if these things are not mandated and regulated. A lot of public perception and stigma. A little bit on psychedelics. They have this history of association with counterculture movement, recreational use, people kind of, freaking out and losing their minds, right? So the the ability to bridge that with understanding the potential therapeutic benefits is a major undertaking, because of a lot of that stigma that's already there. We already kind of touched on the regulatory and legal issues. Obviously, if something is illegal, it's going to not be occurring legally, so that can impact all of the above. And then dependency, we talked a little bit more about that. A problematic pattern of use, that is, always something to consider. Just a little bit more on some of the major research that's going on in these areas. I have some references to these at the conclusion if you want to dive deeper. Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, University of California, San Francisco, Mount Sinai has a lot of trials going. And I want to make sure I note that even here at in Nebraska, UNMC is conducting some psilocybin research as well on a limited basis, fairly new, but there are great uses of organized and appropriate research underway. So UNMC, pardon me, my voice, the main focus, this is being supervised by Dr. Lou Lucas, trying to reduce psychological distress in persons with inoperable pancreatic cancer with the use of psilocybin. Again, this is all done under protocols that have been well established. These protocols started to take shape in the 60s, were shut down in the 70s, and the research kind of picked back up in the late 90s, but the protocol is pretty much well established. So if time allows, I can talk about that protocol a little bit too. Want to switch gears a little bit and just kind of talk about an example of how mental health implications with specifically psilocybin use or treatment, how they kind of compare, contrast. Want to dive a little deeper into the default mode network. So the default mode network is this system of connected brain areas that shows increased activity when a person is not focused on what's happening around them, right? So when we're kind of not, engaged in kind of who we are, where we are, what we're doing, when we're just kind of, some might say at peace, or just kind of almost deconstructed, right? All the things that make up, who we are and what we're doing. That's what the default mode network's for. And as an example, I'll use something like a forest, right? The analogy or explanation of a forest, right? When we are young, impressionable, kind of concrete operational, we are developing our belief system. And I think of that as, a path that's being, carved out on the ground. Something as simple as, fire's hot, don't touch the stove, right? You'll get burned. Pretty rational, pretty healthy thing to instill in a young person, right? So the belief is the pathway, right? If I touch something that's hot, I will get burned, that will hurt. And over time, there's probably a lot of examples of that working well. It's the belief that's serving you well. Dirt kind of covers the path. but it still remains under the dirt. It gets overgrown with vegetation, trees, and the forest. So underneath all of that is a belief, along with many, many others that we kind of hold, and it's things that we believe about ourselves or the world, other people, and off we go, right? Have a happy, healthy life. So the concern there is we are designed, our minds are really designed to be on autopilot a lot of the time. That's, again, with the support of the default mode network. A quick example of that is to imagine your first day of class, right? You spend 20 seconds thinking about your first day of class or your first day at your current job. How'd you sleep the night before? How'd you leave the house in the morning? What route did you take? Where'd you get coffee? Where did you park? How do you get in the building? Where do you go? Where do I sit, right? Where's my stuff? Innately, there's a lot of stress associated with that. So that's an example of the default mode network kind of being challenged. Like, hey, I don't know how this goes, so I have to kind of figure it out. After maybe day 2, 3, 10, maybe think about how things are going today, right? Hopefully kind of on autopilot. Don't have to think critically and intensely about how your days go. You just kind of go. And this is where things like trauma, for example, can be very challenging because back to the forest analogy, trauma could be, like a meteor hitting the forest, creating a big crater, fracturing some of those established pathways of what I believe about myself, believe about the world or other people. It could also be a maybe more slow and distressing path by being in a traumatic situation or even a relationship for a long period of time. So, a singular traumatic event or traumatic experiences over time. These also will kind of shut off that default mode network, right? We don't know what to do. We don't know how to process. It's impacting lots of other areas of our life, and it can really scar that well-established system of pathways under the forest. So some of those paths could be irrational in nature. So I'll quickly jump to one type of example of how someone might go to get help for something like that. Reaching out to a mental health professional, maybe picking up a workbook on cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So this is an attempt to kind of impact someone's belief system, but the challenge is that the default mode network is in place because it's supposed to be in place. It is, right? It's there to protect you, to help you not have to think about everything all the time. So the challenge of, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy and dealing with, someone who wants to change something in their life. I'll give a brief example. We talked about, fire's hot. That belief is fine. No reason to mess with it. For example, if the belief was red means go, right? Okay, our life might be a little complicated if I believe at my core that red means go, right? I'm blowing through intersections, I'm crashing into stuff. Hopefully people are asking me, what are you doing? And I might go seek some cognitive behavioral therapy to figure out, right, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? The real basis for this is that, A, seeing something red equals C, I go. And hopefully you would have the opportunity to slow down, unpack that with someone and say, gee, that sounds like you've been operating that way for a long time. Like this is something you truly believe. And, when did you learn that? Maybe when you were very young, someone for some reason taught you that and it's stuck. So the process can be it's not necessarily long. It really depends on the person and some of the same things that we talked about earlier. You know, the set of the person, where they are in their life, the setting. Are you feeling like you can work on and honestly address some of these things, for example, in therapy or you know, on your own in your life? But you identify a belief that is irrational or unhealthy, or maybe a traumatic event or a series of traumas that are, you know, causing problems for you in your life. And when you identify that one, you realize that A does not cause C. A plus B is C, right? The event that occurs, seeing something red, the belief that I should go, and then the emotional or behavioral consequence, right? I speed up, I go. So then over time, you challenge that belief and you work through that and hopefully replace it with a new, you know, healthy or rational belief. Again, the problem is the default mode network is firmly in place, protecting all of our beliefs, whether they're rational or irrational, healthy or unhealthy, right? We're on autopilot a lot of the time. So, you know, habits are hard to break, right? Life gets in the way. So these perception shifting experiences, as an example, which is what a psilocybin treatment might hope to do, is to shut down the default mode network and work on this issue with a new perception that is then integrated into life, right? Sounds simple. Why wouldn't everybody just go do that? These are profound experiences, and they are not to be taken lightly, not to be replicated outside of a clinical environment. But they have three components. I know we're close on time, so I'm going to just walk through that because, again, I know we wanted to learn about psilocybin. So if someone was going to participate in psilocybin-assisted therapy, the first phase or stage is preparation. It's designed to set the stage for a safe and meaningful psychedelic experience. Establishing trust between the participant, facilitator, supportive environment. You clarify intentions for this journey that you want to go on. This includes initial assessments, lots of screenings. There are sessions that lead up to it, a lot of education. These are all very important protocols that are followed. The journey phase is the actual administration of psilocybin. You are going to experience this altered state of consciousness. It's guided and supported by trained facilitators. It's a carefully measured dose, supported controlled environment. You might get verbal guidance and some therapeutic techniques to kind of help navigate. There's already some predetermined things that you are probably wanting to work on or unlock or resolve that you took care of in your preparation. The setting, the music environment, eye coverings, headphones, things like that are there. So it's important to differentiate this from illicit use or recreational use, right? If someone is using psilocybin just to feel a little bit better, to enhance something that they're doing, or to kind of change the way things are looking externally, that's more the illicit or recreational use. This is more of an inward journey where you are therapeutically going to try to resolve something.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
It's Jenny. I'm going to interrupt you. This classroom is being used after, so we're going to give just a few minutes for questions if you don't mind. And then I also want, if you would mind getting me your presentation so we can get that out to on our website and to people that would like to see it.
For sure. I'll just flip to this last slide, and then if we have questions. Integration is the last part, and it's not just, hey, you're done, bye, go home, hope life is great. There are sessions scheduled for follow-up. The purpose is to try to integrate the experience into very meaningful and substantial changes in someone's life. Additional coping strategies, action steps, lots of things there. So lots of references, some suggested reading. And how about questions?
Do we have any questions in here? Yeah.
In Nebraska, psilocybin and psychedelic mushrooms are illegal, but I see at the head shops that they have like fake mushrooms. What's up with the fake mushrooms, and how do they get around the state law here in Nebraska to be able to sell them at a head shop?
Jeff, did you hear that question?
I did, yeah. And right, like if we looked at the big gamut of all the different substances, right, I would compare that kind of to some of the alternate cannabis that you can find, right? These other compounds that have similar effects, but you know, I would just say big question mark, right? Like if this is not the actual substance that, you know, has been researched and approved, right, and is available legally, then I would just, you know, right, have a big question. Yeah, and I've had people tell me about, you know, going to flea markets, right, and people have a table of mushrooms, and these will make you feel this way, and these will make you feel that way. You know, it's kind of like the black market, right? But again, there's shops that are saying we're selling these things and we're saying this will have these effects, but you're really just kind of being a true experimenter, right? Because you don't know. So I would say, you know, buyer beware. And I think there's also some significant, you know, kind of turning the other way. We saw that a lot with, you know, cannabis as it approached decriminalization in many states, where people just kind of stopped paying attention to it. Like, okay, well, we know that's not that big a deal, or we know that that's coming down the road, so we're not going to, you know, go breaking down doors or investigating, you know, shops that are, you know, selling these things, which I know is very counterintuitive when you think of how this all started with a war on drugs, that it's pretty diluted at this point.
Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Of course.
And